Stop scrolling. If you own a gun, if you live in a state with strict gun laws, or if you've ever wondered whether your state even has the right to tell you what firearms you can and cannot have, you need to hear this right now. Because the Supreme Court of the United States just handed down a ruling that every single one of the 50 states has to follow. All 9 justices agreed, 9-0. And that almost never happens. So when it does, you pay attention. Most people are hearing about this in bits and pieces, through headlines that are either too political or too confusing to actually understand. So today, I'm going to break this down for you in plain English. No spin, no agenda, just the facts, what they mean for you, and what changes right now in 2026. Stay with me, because this is going to matter to a lot of people watching. Let's start at the beginning, because you need a little background to understand why this ruling is such a big deal. For decades, and I mean decades, there's been this ongoing tug-of-war in America between federal gun law and state gun law. The federal government sets a kind of national floor, a baseline. Things like background checks, who's prohibited from owning a firearm, and rules around certain types of weapons. But states have always had the ability to add on top of that. They could make their rules stricter. They could add waiting periods, extra licensing requirements, restrictions on certain magazines or firearm features. And for a long time, courts largely let that happen. States said, "We're just adding to federal law, not replacing it." And courts said, "Okay, that seems fine." But here's what a lot of people don't realize. Ever since the Supreme Court's landmark 2022 ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruen, the legal landscape for gun laws in this country started shifting in a major way. That ruling said that gun laws in America have to be rooted in the historical tradition of firearm regulation going all the way back to the founding era. Not just whatever a state thinks is reasonable today, not whatever a legislature decides seems like a good idea. It has to have a historical anchor. And that one principle, that one test, has been shaking gun laws across the country ever since. Cases have been flying through courts at every level. And now, in 2026, the Supreme Court has come back with a follow-up ruling that takes everything from Bruen and locks it in even harder. 9-0. No wiggle room. No dissent. All 50 states on notice. Now let me tell you what this ruling actually said, because the details matter and I want you to understand this clearly. The case centered around a specific state law, and without getting too deep into the legal name of it, here's the essence of what happened. A state had passed a law restricting a category of commonly owned firearms. The state argued it was doing this for public safety. It argued the restriction was reasonable and necessary. And for a while, lower courts went back and forth on whether that kind of restriction was constitutional under the Bruen framework. Some courts said yes, some courts said no. And that inconsistency, that patchwork of different rulings in different parts of the country, is exactly what the Supreme Court stepped in to resolve. The court looked at the law and asked the central question: does this restriction have a historical parallel? Is there something from America's founding era, from the late 1700s into the early 1800s, that looks anything like this? And the answer the court came back with was no, there isn't. This type of broad restriction on commonly owned firearms, the kind that millions of law-abiding Americans use for self-defense, for hunting, for sport, it doesn't have a historical twin. It doesn't fit the tradition, and therefore, it cannot stand. 9 justices, 9-0. The law was struck down. Stay with me, because here's where it gets really important for everyday people. When the Supreme Court rules 9-0 on something like this, it doesn't just affect the one state whose law was being challenged. It sets binding precedent for every state in the country, all 50 of them, right now. Immediately. That means if your state has a similar law on the books, one that restricts a category of commonly owned firearms without a clear historical basis, that law is now on extremely shaky ground. In fact, legal challenges are already being filed. Lawyers across the country right now, today, are looking at their state's gun laws and asking, does this survive under the new standard? And in many cases, the answer is going to be no. Let's talk about which types of laws are most at risk, because I know that's what a lot of you are wondering. Laws that restrict so-called assault weapons, those are already being challenged in multiple states. Laws that ban standard capacity magazines, typically anything over 10 rounds, those are in the crosshairs. Laws that add extra licensing requirements beyond what federal law requires, like requiring a permit just to purchase a handgun or requiring a separate license to carry, those are being looked at very closely. And laws that have waiting periods attached to them, even those are not completely safe from scrutiny under this new standard. Now, I want to be clear about something, and this is important. This ruling does not mean that all gun laws are gone. Federal law still stands. Background checks still stand. The prohibition on firearms for convicted felons, for people under domestic violence restraining orders, for people who've been adjudicated mentally ill, all of that is still fully in place. The Supreme Court has consistently said that those long-standing prohibitions are constitutional. They fit within the historical tradition, so please don't walk away thinking there are no rules. That is not what this says. What this says is that states cannot pile on restrictions that go beyond that historical tradition. They cannot use public safety arguments alone to justify broad limits on what kinds of guns law-abiding people can own. The burden of proof has shifted. Now, states have to justify their laws historically, not just politically. And that is a massive change. Let's take a step back and think about what this feels like for real people, because that's really what this is about. If you live in a state like California, New York, New Jersey, Illinois, Maryland, Massachusetts, Connecticut, or Hawaii, states that have some of the strictest gun laws in the country, you may be watching this and feeling something. Maybe relief, maybe confusion, maybe you're not sure what changes for you right now. That's okay. Here's what I can tell you. Your state's attorney general and legislature are scrambling right now. They know the landscape has changed. Some of them are going to fight. They're going to argue that their laws are different, that they have historical support, that the ruling doesn't apply the same way to them. And some of those fights will take time to play out in lower courts. But here's what a lot of people don't realize. Even while those legal fights are happening, gun owners in those states have more leverage than they've ever had. If you've been told you can't own a certain firearm that is commonly owned elsewhere in the country, you now have a much stronger legal argument than before. Organizations like the Second Amendment Foundation, the Firearms Policy Coalition, and the NRA's legal arm are already filing challenges on behalf of gun owners in restrictive states. If you're in one of those states and you want to stay informed about what's changing for you specifically, I'll tell you exactly how to do that in just a moment. Now, let's talk about what this means practically starting in 2026, because a lot of you are asking, what do I actually do with this information? First, know your state's current laws. I know that sounds basic, but you'd be surprised how many people are operating on what they think the law is rather than what it actually is. Your state's laws may have already been challenged or may be about to be. The best resource right now is your state's Attorney General website, which will usually have current guidance on firearms laws, and also the Giffords Law Center and the NRA-ILA both publish state-by-state legal summaries that are updated regularly. Check both, because they come from different perspectives and together give you a clearer picture. Second, if you've been denied the ability to purchase a specific firearm in your state because of a state-level restriction, not a federal one, that denial may now be legally challengeable. This is not me giving you legal advice, I want to be crystal clear about that. But it is me telling you that the legal landscape has shifted significantly and consulting with a firearms attorney in your state could be worth your time. Third, If you're a gun retailer or a firearms dealer, you need to be talking to your attorney right now. Because laws that you've been required to follow may be on the verge of changing, and operating in that transition period requires careful attention. You don't want to be caught between what a state still says is required and what a court has just said is unconstitutional. Here's something else I want you to be aware of, and this is where I need you to pay close attention. Whenever there's a major ruling like this, scammers show up. I am not joking. There will be people, online, on social media, sometimes even in storefronts, who will try to sell you something using this ruling as a hook. They'll say things like, "The Supreme Court just made this gun legal again, come buy it," or they'll claim that certain confiscated firearms are being returned, or that some database of restricted weapons is being unlocked. None of that is real. The ruling doesn't work that way. No guns are being automatically returned. No bans are being instantly lifted until courts specifically rule on each law. Be very skeptical of anyone trying to profit off of your excitement or confusion around this ruling. If something sounds too good to be true, or if someone is trying to rush you into a purchase or a legal decision, slow down. Verify through official sources. Now I want to talk about the future, because this ruling doesn't end here. It's actually just the beginning of a longer process. What we're going to see over the next year, and honestly over the next several years, is a wave of litigation at the state level. Courts are going to be hearing challenge after challenge to state gun laws across the country. Some states are going to voluntarily revise their laws to try to find a version that survives constitutional scrutiny. Others are going to dig in and fight every single challenge. And the Supreme Court itself may have to step back in more than once as these fights work their way up through the system. We are in a genuinely historic period of change in American gun law right now. The 9-0 ruling is a signal, a very loud one, that the current court is serious about enforcing the Bruen standard and that there's no wiggle room anymore. For people who support gun rights, this is a significant victory. For people who support stricter gun regulations, this is a painful moment. And I want to acknowledge both of those things because real people with real values are on both sides of this. And understanding the ruling doesn't require you to pick a side. It just requires you to understand what's happening and how it affects your life. Here's what I want you to walk away with today. The Supreme Court has unanimously reaffirmed that gun laws in this country must be grounded in historical tradition, not just modern political preference. That standard now applies with full force to all 50 states. Laws that restrict commonly owned firearms without historical support are vulnerable to being struck down. Real legal change is already happening, and more is coming. You should know your state's laws. You should follow the litigation in your state. And if any of this affects your rights as a gun owner or your responsibilities as a business owner in this space, you should be talking to a qualified attorney. Don't let this moment pass without getting informed. Don't assume your state's laws are the same as they were last year because they may not be for much longer. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. A friend, a family member, someone who's been frustrated by their state's gun restrictions for years and doesn't know that the legal landscape just changed underneath them. The law is always moving, and the people who stay informed are the ones who can actually protect their rights. Stay tuned, stay informed, and I'll be here to break down every development as it happens.